Good afternoon, everyone. It's Noah Nelson here from Trident Utilities. Thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar with the Housing Association ABRI. Today, we'll be looking into the challenges around net zero, and in particular, how to create a carbon reporting strategy. Next slide. I will shortly be introducing you to our speakers, but first a quick look at what we have in store for you for the next 30 minutes or so. We will give a brief introduction into Trident for those of you who are not familiar with us, and then taking a look at what our carbon credentials are. We will touch on the wider 2050 Net Zero Challenge and provide an explainer around what CO2 equivalents are, an overview of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and how we should all be measuring CO2e. What are science-based targets, and how does all this fit in with the 6 carbon budget? We'll be looking into specific challenges for housing associations, what the risk considerations and opportunities are, and also a detailed overview of ABRI's journey to date and how carbon accounting software can add value to the journey. This will all take around 30 minutes or so, assuming we're on schedule, and then we'll open it up to questions that come in along the way. In case we run out of time and don't manage to get to all the questions, don't worry. We'll be sending out a recording after this webinar to all of the attendees with those answers. As often with webinars, there are often some technical issues. We'll have people joining in from home, so apologize in advance for any background noises you might hear, dogs barking, Amazon deliveries, children having a full-blown meltdown in the background. You know, all of the usual things we have to contend with. Next slide. On this webinar is myself, an account director here at Trident. I've worked with dozens of housing associations over the last 10 years. I am joined by 2 wonderful people, Chris Wilson, a senior engineering consultant who is one of our leading carbon net zero specialists, and our special guest from ABRI, Rose Bean, who is Director of Assets and Sustainability. Thank you for all joining me today. Next slide. Trident have been around for over 20 years and have been working with housing associations for over 10 of these. At present, we work with a couple of dozen housing associations with stock that represents several 100,000 homes. From this experience, we have a deep understanding of housing associations' challenges and requirements. Trident provide a 360-degree expertise which covers 3 main pillars: cost control, carbon control, and compliance. Cost control includes budget-driven procurement and reporting strategies. Compliance includes legislative requirements like SECR and ESOS, and carbon deals with an organization's approach to net zero, technology, and efficiency. Now more than ever, these 3 pillars are intersecting. The 360 degrees is cumulative of our people. Every person is an expert in their area. So when cost control, carbon control, and compliance are combined, we're able to provide organizations with real expertise and value. Next slide. Thank you. There have been a few studies carried out in the past that highlight the challenges organizations face when they try to go about their net zero journey completely by themselves without any external support. One of the biggest challenges, not surprisingly, is around the data. In one study, error rates with calculations and conversion factors were as high as 40%. 66% of organizations excluded their Scope 3 emissions. 81% of organizations in the study didn't fully capture their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and in total, only 9% of A lot of organizations we speak to worry about these challenges. They have concerns over the lack of education across the organization, what everything means, why it matters, resource and time commitment that will be involved. That leads into perceived cost worries and the overall scope of the challenge. We're hoping today through this webinar to provide some level of comfort that these challenges are able to be overcome using ABRI as one example. We also want to focus in on the positives, which we'll touch on throughout this webinar, relating to the benefits of moving forward on your net zero journey. Now, I'd like to turn the time over to one of our carbon experts, Chris Wilson.
So, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Chris Wilson from Trident. I'm going to take a look at some of the technical considerations associated with mapping a carbon footprint through to the pathways to net zero. Now, when mapping a carbon footprint, it's essential that our clients and ABRI understand some of the technical terms that they'll encounter going through the process. And one of the things to look at, which can cause some misunderstanding, is CO2 equivalent. So what's this? CO2 and CO2 equivalent are different things, and you'll see this in publications, and people do get them mixed up and not understood properly. But global heating, it's caused by the release of a number of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There are 7 main greenhouse gases, and as you can see, CO2 is the major one, but there are others such as CH4, which is methane. There's fluorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, which are refrigerant gases. And some of these other gases, although CO2 is the main contributor to global heating, some of the others are just as important, if not more important. So, for example, methane, which is CH4, that's emitted mainly by the oil and gas industry, but also from agriculture and landfill, and it's around 28 times more potent than CO2. That's its global warming potential. Refrigerant gases, they can be thousands of times more potent. And a single activity, such as heating a home or driving a van, car, it can have multiple greenhouse gases emitted in different quantities. So mapping a carbon footprint could really be quite confusing and complicated if you had to map all the different elements, all the different gases at the same time. So what CO2 allows us to do, it allows us to bundle the different greenhouse gases together, each with different global warming potentials, to be expressed as one single metric in terms of CO2 equivalent. So it sort of combines them all together. And it's really important for transparency because, as I say, there is some misunderstanding of what is the difference. And to put it into perspective, CO2 emissions in 2020 for the UK were around 326 million tonnes, whereas total greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalent, were 414 million, so 30% higher than just CO2. And it's worth also noting that these gases have different lifetimes. So CO2 stays in the atmosphere for around a couple of thousand years, whereas methane, around 80% will be removed in 20 years from the point of time when it's been emitted. And we'll come back to that sort of point later, because that's important in terms of understanding how we get a carbon budget. So next slide, please. So having gone through an education and understanding process with clients, we then examine how we'd calculate a carbon footprint based on the activities carried out, and in this case, for ABRI. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, this is the protocol that the whole world uses really in terms of the way in which it calculates a carbon footprint. And it breaks down a carbon footprint into 3 scopes across the whole value chain of an organisation. Scope 1, that's the central pillar here. These are the direct emissions into the atmosphere from an organisation's activities. So, for example, as we can see here, it could be from company vehicles or company facilities. And so these would be the emissions for either gas or diesel straight from the exhaust pipe or from a flue into the atmosphere. So they're classed as direct emissions. Indirect emissions, in the main, certainly for ABRI, we're looking at electricity here, and these are classed as indirects rather than direct. So even though ABRI have control over it in terms of every time they switch on a light or an air conditioning unit, but the emissions don't happen directly on their site. They happen at the power station. So they have less control over that. Okay. And Scope 3, these are all the other parts of a carbon footprint, and there are 15 separate Scope 3 categories which we have to look at when we're pulling together a carbon footprint, and they break down between upstream activities and downstream activities. I'm not going to go through all 15 today, but I'm just going to look at sort of 4 elements on a carbon footprint which were particularly applicable for ABRI. The first one in the middle is company vehicles, circled in the middle there in red. So ABRI have a fleet of about circa 1,500 vans. These vans are the maintenance vans that go around servicing the portfolio of homes which ABRI have. And they contribute significantly to the carbon footprint of ABRI. And the challenge there will be, how can you decarbonise your transport fleet over the next 10 years or so? Looking at scope 3, the first one to look at is purchase goods and services. ABRI spends around several tens of millions of pounds every year to support their 40,000 homes. And so this is the embodied emissions of all the products that they buy in a year. So for example, boilers for houses, kitchens, cement, bricks, etc. And these all come with an embodied carbon. The long-term challenge for ABRI will be to work with the supply chain to source products with a lower embodied carbon. And the third one is capital goods. So that's circled here. For capital goods, these are the embodied emissions associated with building new homes for ABRI. ABRI build approximately 1,000 homes per annum. This all obviously has a sort of embodied emissions. Now, as operational emissions, i.e. the in-use emissions of a house or a home reduce over the coming years, as they will do with tighter building regulations and EPCs, which are gradually being tightened, then the embodied emissions become a larger proportion of the total life cycle emissions of a house. So it's really important that we start to sort of understand the embodied emissions that go into a house. How can we move to a lower carbon building? Assuming between 30 to 50 tonnes per house embodied emissions that go into building a house, then this is circa 50,000 tonnes per annum for ABRI, so a considerable part of their footprint. And the final one on the right hand side, which we looked at as being really a key for ABRI, is downstream leased assets. So this is the emissions from all their homes which they have in their portfolio. These are emissions over which ABRI have little or no real operational control, because every tenant has their own electricity and gas supply, and they can choose to have heating on or lighting on as much as they want or can afford. However, responsibility for that some of that responsibility does lie with ABRI, because ABRI are responsible for supplying a home which is affordable to run, is warm and is efficient in its operation. And we use EPCs, energy performance certificates, to calculate the sort of assumed emissions for each of these homes. We have to use EPCs because, as I say, we won't know the actual emissions of each of the individual homes. So once we've mapped the carbon footprint, which is really the essential starting point, we can then start to talk about decarbonisation pathways. Next slide, please. Inevitably then, when talking about carbon reductions and decarbonisation, science-based targets is a terminology which is never far behind. But what are science-based targets? Now, science-based targets, they provide a clearly defined pathway for companies or organisations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, helping to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Science-based targets are considered science-based if they're in line with the latest climate science. And basically, they were established to help organisations set reduction targets in line with the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. And the goal of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was set at COP21, is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, and preferably 1.5 degrees C compared to pre-industrial levels. And the Paris Climate Change Agreement has now been adopted or signed up to by about 196 countries. And in simple terms, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, it asks countries to work to achieve levelling off of emissions as soon as possible, and certainly within the next decade, by 2030, and to become greenhouse gas neutral in the second half of the century, so to become net zero by 2050. So the main components of a science-based target are 50% reduction by 2030, which is classed as a near-term target, and to be net zero no later than 2050. And so any company or organisation that signs up to a science-based target, they must have a science-based plan that supports these targets. Next slide, please. So once we've set a science-based target, we can then define the pathway that we need to follow to meet these targets. And this is the UK's road to net zero. As previously mentioned, CO2 lasts more or less forever, thousands of years in the atmosphere. So the CO2 that we emit today will still be in the atmosphere by 2050. It's therefore possible to estimate a total budget that we can emit to stay within a certain temperature limit, i.e. 1.5 degrees. And that's actually a frighteningly small amount of carbon that we're going to be able to burn between now and 2050 in compared to what's already been burnt since the Industrial Revolution. So the UK has therefore set a carbon budget, and it's set by the Climate Change Committee. The most recent carbon budget set is Carbon Budget 6, and that brings us up to 2037. And as we can see with the dotted white line here, this then, more importantly, maps our transition for the UK to net zero. It defines that we must be net zero by 2050 on the right side of the graph, but it also, more importantly, requires the UK to achieve a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035, and that's halfway through Carbon Budget 6. And this has now actually been enshrined in law that the UK has to achieve a 78% reduction by 2035. So I think the implication of this really is quite clear for individuals and for organisations. UK businesses are going to need to invest in decarbonisation in line with this pathway if the UK stands any chance of meeting net zero by 2050 and 78% reduction by 2035. And ABRI have set some really challenging decarbonisation targets across their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And that's to be net zero across their own direct emissions, scope 1 and 2 by 2030. And to be net zero across all scopes by 2050. So I'm now going to hand over to Rose Bean, who's the Director of Assets and Sustainability from ABRI, who's going to look at some of the risk consideration and opportunities for ABRI moving forward.
Great, thanks, Chris. So I'll give a bit of an overview of ABRI before I come on to the wider kind of risks and opportunities. So ABRI is one of the South of England's largest housing providers. We've got around 40,000 assets and homes, and we're currently working across 37 local authorities. In terms of our development aspirations, we're also looking to build in excess of 10,000 homes by 2030. The other key point about ABRI is we're also a founding member of the Greener Futures Partnership. So that's a major collaboration between 5 housing associations in the sector. So ABRI, Anchor, Hyde, Home Group and Sanctuary. And it was really born out of a collective desire to deal with the challenges associated with sustainable social housing. So that includes thinking about how we're going to transition to net zero. So combined, the partners have around 300,000 homes and 600,000 customers. So we're really well placed to deliver both the technical solutions required to reach net zero, whilst also scaling up retrofit activity. So ABRI is really heavily engaged both in terms of our own transition to net zero, which Chris has touched on, but also working more broadly in the social housing sector to identify the solutions the sector needs to transition to a net zero economy. Next slide, please. So in terms of the risks and opportunities associated with net zero, and looking at this very specifically through the lens of a social housing provider, the social housing sector alone is looking at around an additional 36 billion above current investment plans in order to decarbonise existing homes. So increasingly as a sector, we're starting to look at how can we fund net zero whilst critically maintaining development pipelines, so increasing the supply of new homes. And we know that the current funding regime through the Social Housing Decarb Fund represents a really small proportion of the overarching cost of achieving net zero. So in terms of kind of longer term funding solutions, we're seeing generally greater appetite from institutional investors in retrofit activity. Equally, we're seeing a number of off-balance sheet funding solutions also start to emerge at this stage. So this really brings us back to kind of investor requirements and considerations at this stage. So there is far greater focus at this stage on organisations' carbon footprints and exposure to climate risks. And this is largely being driven by the mandatory climate disclosure regime, which in the longer term will be extended across the wider economy. So from a social housing provider's point of view, developing a really robust understanding of the emissions generated by your business and your exposure to climate risks as a result, and being able to articulate how you plan to reach net zero will be fundamental to your longer term funding strategy. I think the other point here in terms of reporting, the Sustainability Reporting Standard for Social Housing has sought to standardise ESG reporting requirements for investors. But the anticipation within that is that housing providers that have adopted the standard should be moving towards being able to report on their full scope of emissions. So starting to include scope 3 emissions is really key to advancing your ESG reporting at this stage. I think the other point on this really is around credibility. So we're seeing generally much more focus on the issue of greenwashing, and the social housing sector is not necessarily immune to this. We saw in the lead up to COP27 new guidance issued on net zero commitments by businesses and financial institutions. And that really did signpost the need for transition plans to be built on a robust understanding of climate emissions, but that your net zero pathways have to be aligned to climate science. So we're seeing increasingly kind of greater focus on the credibility of the plans that are being put out there. I think in terms of the opportunities this presents, there are increasing opportunities coming through the sector in terms of partnerships, which could really accelerate net zero delivery, particularly from a funding point of view. But I think, importantly, as social landlords, our focus will be very much on the wider community and customer benefits that net zero and decarbonising existing homes provide. And there is massive social value attributed to decarbonising existing homes. So from the point of view of health and well-being, for example. But more broadly, the UK's net zero transition also provides major opportunities in terms of green skills and employment opportunities for social housing customers. So there are really significant social and economic benefits attributed to net zero transition plans. So that very much leads me into ABRI's journey so far and the work we've been doing with Trident. So next slide, please. So in terms of ABRI's journey, we implemented a new environment and climate strategy last May, and that was really the product of a 12-month project in which we worked extensively to develop our understanding of the emissions generated by our business. And ABRI was really starting from a point of we were only accounting for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and our net zero plans at that point in time really only covered existing homes. So in order to move forwards, we very much wanted to develop a strategy covering the entirety of our business activities. I think as a general observation in the sector, net zero is often incorporated within asset management strategies, and that is driven by the fact that our portfolios are generating a significant amount of our emissions. But it's really important that we plan for the wider transition to net zero. So we do need to pick up the corporate transition. So thinking about how we're going to transition our fleet, how we're going to decarbonise our supply chain. So it's really important that that wider and more holistic approach is picked up. So as part of that project, we worked extensively with Trident to establish our scope 3 emissions and develop our carbon accounting. And in order to achieve that, we immersed a couple of colleagues pretty much full time in that process over a couple of months. And I'll come on to some of our learning from that. At the same time as developing our carbon accounting and our net zero strategy, we also ran a dedicated 12-month programme with our board and our executive team. And through that process, we explored everything from the macro implications of climate change through to the specific implications for ABRI, and that included developing our awareness of climate risks and opportunities. So from a risk perspective, we aligned to the recommendations of the TCFD in order to develop our understanding of climate risks and opportunities and how we would be managing those. So I guess the key point here is really in terms of good governance, increasingly, boards will need to demonstrate sufficient competency and oversight of climate considerations, and also be able to demonstrate that climate considerations have been embedded in board decision making, which is why, as part of ABRI's journey, we invested considerably in bringing our board's collective awareness up. But that was fundamentally supported by the work we were doing in terms of understanding the emissions generated by our business. So it was all part of a package which led us to developing a new strategy. So as a result of the work undertaken with Trident, and as Chris has touched on, we developed net zero pathways, which will support us to achieve net zero across our operations by 2030 and across our supply chain and homes by 2050. And as a result of that piece of work, we now have annual reduction targets in place in order to ensure that we deliver that. I guess in terms of just some of the challenges we experienced along the way, I think Scope 3 emissions are really more challenging to measure. So working alongside Trident, we did take an initial screening process to identify where we had real hotspot emissions and also to target where we would engage with our supply chain. And we really recognised that our carbon emissions and our accounting protocols would continue to develop over time. I think the only other point I would raise around the challenges that we had, the first year in which we assessed our carbon emissions was actually during the pandemic. So actually we had to recognise that our emissions would grow as we continue to develop our emission accounting every year. So that's something we had to be really minded of. I think the final point I would touch on around what we learned through this process is we had a dedicated team in place that worked to develop kind of their understanding of carbon emissions. We really don't want to centralise this in the business going forwards. So we've apportioned our emissions to different teams within the business. Going forwards, we're going to roll that out. So actually the understanding of carbon emissions and how we calculate this across the business will be developed. And that's really about developing a culture of buy-in and ownership in terms of reducing emissions, creating the projects that are required in order to achieve that. So we took some really, really rich learning from the process with Trident, which is supporting us effectively to move forwards as an organisation on this journey. So Noah, I'll hand back to you at this stage.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Before I go into the next slide, I just want to say a huge thank you to Chris for sharing his knowledge in this area, and then a big thank you to Rose for sharing the challenges that housing associations face on this journey and tying in with lessons learned and takeaways from their journey. A key part of this, as we've alluded to throughout the webinar, is detailed carbon accounting software, and Trident are able to provide this software that is aligned to the British standard PAS 2060, which is the British standard for carbon neutrality, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the United Nations Race to Zero, which is science-based aligned. Software is key because it helps you go from using only spreadsheets to a dashboard that helps you monitor, measure, and track performance as you move forward towards those key net zero targets, pathways, and objectives. Most importantly, the software is designed to be simple to understand, icon-based, intuitive, and allows you to start seeing some of these metrics come to life, and the organization's also able to kind of see from at a glance where you are in the journey. So you can see that progress year on year, whilst also capturing key intensity metrics like the amount of carbon you emit based on something specific that you do, key analysis across your carbon footprint, tracking by category, scope, energy, all 15 of those scope 3 categories between upstream and downstream, as well as additional functionality kind of one level down that allows you to see analysis and changes to the carbon footprint by scope, by category, and by site. The tool that we used with that process and in terms of this software and carbon reporting workshops with ABRI and with all other housing associations allow us to help define scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 categories that are applicable to your footprint. We use these carbon reporting workshops to carry out a deep dive into all of the scope 3 categories to determine, with ABRI as an example, their scope 3 emissions, spend-based analysis versus process-based life cycle analysis, to develop a robust data collection plan in terms of what data needs compiling, where's the data going to come from, the calculation methodologies that are going to be applied. And then once we gather that, being able to enter it into the software to calculate a benchmark for the carbon footprint. And when we know where you are with that benchmark and you're doing that year on year, we can start to develop pathways to net zero that are aligned to a science-based target and agreed and written into the environmental and climate strategy. Next slide, please. So a quick summary before I open it up to the questions that we've had along the way. Some of the key points that have come out for today's webinar for me is the challenge to get to net zero is huge, and we've all got to be on board with it. The targets that we need to set need to be science-based. We need to do it according to globally recognized standards like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But a big number for me was the amount of additional investment required for housing and how it's now more than ever being tied to ESG reporting and sustainable financing and your own net zero journey. The challenge for most organizations is around scope 3, which can be up to 90% of your total footprint, and moving forward, capturing and calculating those emissions across your different reporting requirements and using tools like the carbon accounting software to do that. That also has a back end of a library of conversion factors that are kept continually up to date, so you don't have to worry about using the most up-to-date conversion factor. As we kind of mentioned at the beginning, some of the error rates in the studies that have been done were as high as 40%. And that leads us in, to the work that we've done with ABRI in terms of using those workshops as a way to understand their scope 3 emissions, who the data owners are, where the information is going to come from, and getting it into a system. And this is where external experts like Trident can really offer value to the housing sector. And those would be my key takeaways from this webinar. We've had a handful of questions that have come in throughout this, which I'll now run through a few of these. I am conscious of time. The first 3 are for Rose and the last 2 are for Chris, if that's okay. So the first one that we've had come in, this is for Rose, can you please expand on the resource and time commitment needed to assess scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, we did immerse a couple of colleagues in the process over a couple of months. But I think on reflection, the wider benefit that we got from that wasn't just developing kind of our understanding of our emissions, but we really brought the competency of those colleagues up. So actually, as well as, practically delivering on the project, it was a really valuable investment in terms of getting our colleagues into a position where they would be able to take that forwards. So I guess key point is, yes, it's slightly resource heavy for a couple of months, but actually there is a much bigger benefit to be derived from really kind of engaging colleagues on that process.
Thank you, Rose. And one thing I've seen from that journey with yourselves is the kind of through osmosis, the knowledge across the organization grow exponentially from at the very beginning. Not everyone across the organization is going to be an expert with kind of carbon literacy and what it all means, but over time through those workshops, people hear about it and they talk about it and they start to understand what it is and why it all matters. Here's a good one. The next question also for you, Rose, if that's okay. It's one I've heard not just this time, but given the large number of assumptions being incorporated into the calculations, is this still a worthwhile exercise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, it is. I think as a starting point, it really starts to bring to life the impact that your organization is having, which in turn, puts you in a far more credible position in terms of communicating within your organization and to key stakeholders how you're planning to tackle your impact. So though you may be starting from a point where not all your emissions are being captured, there are lots of assumptions behind what you are capturing. It actually puts you in a really strong position to start talking about A, how do we advance our assessment of emissions, but B, we can credibly talk about where we're going in terms of net zero. So yeah, it's a really worthwhile exercise, even if it's not covering your full emissions from day one.
Thank you, Rose. And I've seen that too. And the key message is to get started. And over time, those error margins for scope 3 and those assumptions that are made, albeit quite wide at the beginning, over time will get more narrow and more accurate as you change the way you capture and report this information. So the final question, Rose, several organizations are looking to publish their wider net zero plans, but are still in the very early stages of assessing their Scope 3 emissions, which is often in the too hard to tackle category. Can you credibly publish a strategy without having worked through all of the Scope 3 emissions?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So I think if you look at where investors and stakeholder considerations are going, it's becoming increasingly less credible to basically publish plans for reaching net zero if you can't demonstrate, the extent of your emissions. So I think fundamentally the landscape's changing, whereas a couple of years ago it would have been probably quite accepted. I think there would be quite a question mark if you've not started down that route of assessing your wider emissions before you're publishing plans to, reach net zero by 2030 or 2050. So I think looking ahead to the next couple of years, it's going to become even less credible. So at this stage, I would say, take the time, invest in understanding your emissions before you start publishing those plans.
Thank you, Rose. And Chris, the first one for you. How would we engage with our suppliers to get the data?
I think this is something that we need to work with the client. So the client ultimately it's their suppliers, so we need to provide guidance to the clients. But basically, you would need to start with the biggest suppliers of all your purchased goods and services, because generally what we find is it follows the sort of the normal 80-20 rule that probably 20% of the suppliers, if not less, will be responsible for supplying 80% of the goods which are responsible for the emissions. So if we can look at what are the biggest suppliers and then really establish what type of information they have, what data can they supply to us to start mapping the carbon footprint. So basically to establish if they have any process-based cradle to gate emissions. By that I mean life cycle emissions, right through extraction of materials, through to manufacture of the product, through to shipping to suppliers, and ultimately right through the life cycles of in-use and end of life as well. So if suppliers can start to supply that information in terms of, for example, kilograms of CO2 per product bought, then that would be excellent. But we don't always have that information in the first instance. If they're not developing or implementing their own carbon reporting requirements, that's the suppliers, then we need to work with our suppliers to start to help them to understand what are their emissions, how would they go about calculating their life cycle carbon emissions.
Thank you, Chris. And the key thing for me too is for housing to understand that these suppliers are not going to be only getting these kind of questions from yourself. They'll be getting questions from everyone that they work with, and over time, they will get better at being able to provide this information. So that should also kind of feed directly into the overall scope of the challenge as suppliers get more on board with providing exactly what you need. So here's a good one. Here's another one for you, Chris, if that's okay. So how do we go about calculating purchased goods and services as an example?
Okay. So there's various ways that you can calculate purchased goods and services, and these are defined within the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The first of which is using product level cradle to gate emissions. So that's the sort of thing I was just talking about then, whereby suppliers would be able to tell you the kilograms of CO2 per product that you buy, and therefore if you buy 100 of these items, you could calculate the embodied emissions of that item of equipment. However, often that's not available. So one of the other things that we tend to start with is using spend-based emission factors, and that's using an approach called the environmentally extended input-output analysis. So we use spend-based factors to convert the pounds spent into tons of carbon using industry-specific emission factors. Although it's the simplest approach and the one that most organizations tend to start with, it's an aggregated approach. And what I mean by that is that if you do it year on year, using the same emission factors, the only way that you can actually reduce your carbon emissions is by spending less, which is not feasible. So ultimately, we would have to move from a spend-based approach to use a sort of a process-based life cycle analysis data from our clients.
Thank you, Chris. I've had the question, can we use that spend based forever? And that ties into no, because over time
No.
you can only spend less for so long. And
Yeah,
but through those workshops and through that time taken to gather this and calculate this, we can help you evolve in terms of more accurate calculation methodologies that you're allowed to use based on the guidance.
yeah.
Final
It's a
question.
good place to start.
Yes, I would agree. And I think the key message from the question so far is to not be afraid of just starting, right? I've seen a lot of organizations hold off for various reasons, but getting the ball rolling, you'd be surprised at the momentum that builds as you just start somewhere. Final question, also for you, Chris. I've got 12,000 homes. How do I go about delivering carbon reporting for all of them?
Yeah. I think I mentioned this throughout the webinar. It's very unlikely that we'll have actual consumption data for individual houses. So we're not going to have, 12,000 sets of utility bills saying that this house uses X kilowatt hours of electricity or X kilowatt hours of gas, and therefore this would equate to a certain amount of CO2 emissions. So we therefore have to use the predicted annual usage using energy performance certificates, EPC. So an EPC will tell you, based on the size of house, the type of house, when it was built, what it's been built of, what is the predicted CO2 emissions for that house. And ABRI have EPCs for most of their portfolio now, and so it gives you a predicted emissions for each of these houses, so we can take it from that. There will always be a sort of a performance gap between what's predicted, i.e. the asset-based rating on an EPC, and the actual, but it's as close as we're going to get for now. So there will always be a sort of a difference, but it's a good place to start again.
Thank you, Chris. Next slide and final slide, please. Well, I would like to just make one final note that out of all of the sectors and industries that I've worked within for carbon accounting and net zero style support and reporting, housing I found to be one of the most difficult, between the capital goods, the downstream leased assets, the purchase goods and services, and how a lot of that sits outside of kind of what you do. But the key message, hopefully, from today that everyone can take away is that you're not alone, and there is help that's out there. So, well, that is it, folks. We're out of time. I'm going to bring the webinar to a close, and I'd like to again just say a special thank you to Chris and Rose for joining me today, and thank you all for attending and for your questions. We'll be following this up with a link to the recording and again answers to those questions. Thank you and goodbye.